If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. I just wanted to remind you that this podcast has merch, and this podcast is also on Patreon, and there's some perks that come along with joining the Patreon. I will leave the links to both of those things in the show notes. I have to give a content warning. In this episode, there is suicidal thoughts. So I will leave timestamps in the episode description, as always. So if you want to skip over that part, you can. Alright, now let's get into the episode. History has a way of frequently highlighting the good a person has done, and forgetting that people are complex creatures with sometimes conflicting views. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 14th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people that I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms that I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So some of these subjects obviously would not have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using. But I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was born on May 12, 1820 in Florence, Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Today, that is Florence, Italy. Her mother was Frances Smith and her father was William Edward Nightingale. William was actually born William Edward Shore. William's great-uncle Peter Nightingale left William his estate at Leahurst, and in order for William to get the estate, William had to assume Peter's family name and arms. And you know what? If someone left me an estate in their will and all I had to do was assume their name and arms, then I would be changing my name too. But even before William got his uncle's estate, he was still well off. Both Florence's father and mother came from well-to-do families. So this is not a rags to riches story like Alexander Hamilton's story was. Florence grew up in wealth and privilege. She was closer to her father than she was her mother, though her father had a strict regimen to keep Florence fit. She had to exercise 10 minutes Every day before breakfast, she had to exercise her arms 20 times before she got dressed. In the course of the day, she had to exercise for 20 minutes. If not done well, then she had to exercise for 10 more minutes. I'm not sure what William thought exercising well meant. She had to run down to her gate before breakfast, and every day she had to spend an hour outside before dinner unless she had permission to do otherwise. So I said that Florence was born in Florence, Italy, and that is how she got her name. Her parents named both Florence and Florence's older sister, Frances Parthenope, after the places that they were born in. Parthenope was a Greek settlement that is now a part of Naples. Frances went by Parthenope. Parthenope was Florence's only sibling. Even though both Florence and Parthenope were born in what is now Italy, her parents were from England. Florence didn't spend much time in Florence before her family moved back to England. They moved back to England in 1821. Florence had 4 family homes, one in Embley, Hampshire, Leahurst, and Derbyshire. Like I said, Florence came from wealth and privilege. Florence's parents were not your typical 19th century parents. They believed that girls should be educated just as boys were. Both Florence and her sister studied history, mathematics, languages, classical literature, and philosophy. Florence loved math. She had an ability for collecting and analyzing data. Education was very important to her. She could read and write English, French, German, Italian, Greek, and Latin. In 1838, the Nightingales took a tour of Europe. On this tour, Florence met salon hostess Mary Clark. Mary was different from the women that Florence knew. Mary was not so much of a fan of the upper class life. She didn't like the rules that were placed on upper class women. In Mary's salon, men and women were equal. This was a new idea for Florence because even though her parents believed girls should be educated, they still expected for their daughters to fit the mold of an upper class 19th century woman. They expected them to marry well and make lots of children. Mary showed Florence and Parthenope new things. She took them to private parties, studios, galleries, concerts, operas, theaters, receptions, and balls. Florence spent 4 months in Paris with Mary, and she loved it. Florence and Mary became lifelong friends despite their 27-year age gap. Florence and her sister were different from each other. Florence was more serious about her studies, and she didn't care for fashion like Parthenope did, a fact that drove her mother crazy. Florence did have a love for music, though. She apparently once had a lovely singing voice, but she lost it due to constant sore throats. When Florence first met Queen Victoria, she was a hit. She was graceful, and she gave a flawless presentation of kissing Queen Victoria's hand and backing herself and the train of her dress out of the room. Florence was eager to be a star in her first London season, which would have pleased Florence's mother because what her mother wanted was to see her daughters marry well. But that really wasn't something that Florence was interested in. In February of 1837, Florence got her first, what she called it, call from God. Florence said that God wanted her to reduce human suffering. Florence told her family that she wanted to be a nurse. Her family was not supportive of this. They didn't think that being a nurse was a proper job for Florence. During this time, nurses were seen as just a step above prostitutes. So they thought that Florence being a nurse was beneath them. Now, I said that Florence had no interest in marriage, but that doesn't mean that she didn't have suitors. Florence was an attractive young woman with rich brown hair and gray eyes, and she came from a well-to-do family, so of course she had some suitors. At the age of 17, Florence became friends with a young lady named Henrietta Wyville. Henrietta had two brothers, one named Marmaduke and one named Christopher. Florence thought that the brothers were, quote, very fair in their way. Marmaduke was very fond of Florence. In August of 1840, Marmaduke told Florence's father, quote, of the very great love and affection that has been inspired in me for your second daughter, Miss Florence Nightingale, and which I flatter myself she equally shares, end quote. Then he turned to Florence and said, quote, if I am not mistaken by your manner and looks, then happiest am I of all mortals, but trembling do I wait to hear that you will confide yourself to my care and allow me to become your protector and guardian. End quote. She said no to his marriage proposal. She told her sister that she heard, quote, some things which make me sorry for him, but glad for myself. End quote. Marmaduke wasn't the only one that was interested in Florence. Florence's cousin Henry Nicholson was also a suitor of hers. He was her mathematics tutor. Their courtship lasted 7 years. Henry asked Florence to marry him, but she turned him down. This caused some bad blood between Henry and Florence's family. Henry was heartbroken over Florence's refusal to marry him, and he refused to talk to the Nightingales for years. But eventually he got over it, and he started talking to them again, and he would write Florence often. And after they repaired their relationship, they remained friends. Her most serious suitor was Richard Mockman Milnes. He was a poet, philanthropist, and politician. They courted for 9 years. Richard proposed to Florence, but just like the ones that came before him, she turned him down in 1849. Her family was very displeased with her over this. Her mother and sister both thought that Florence's refusal meant that there was no hope for Florence to get another proposal, and there was no hope now for Parthenope to get a proposal. After her refusal, Richard went on to marry another, and just like Henry, Richard remained close to Florence and friendly to the Nightingales. Richard was her most serious suitor, but he was not her last. She had another suitor named Sir Harry Verney. He asked her to marry him, and her response was, hey, maybe you should marry my sister. So she introduced him to her sister, and he married Parthenope that following year. So that was 4 marriage proposals and 4 marriage refusals. But there was another person that may have wanted to marry Florence. His name was Benjamin Jowett. He worked at the University of Oxford. Together, Florence and Benjamin tried to create a new professorship of statistics at Oxford, but no one else wanted that, so there was not a professor of statistics until 1948. Florence and Benjamin's friendship lasted 30 years. In his letters to her, he worried about her reclusiveness and the impact that it had on her friends and family. He said that reprimanding her was like, quote, pouring cold water on a hot iron and producing a terrible hissing, end quote. So that is 5 people that was interested in Florence, 4 of which we know for a fact wanted to marry her. So either Florence was just the cat's meow, or she was just that rich, or maybe both. She kept turning down suitors because she didn't believe that her future was marriage. She believed that God wanted her to help others. She believed that she was supposed to be a nurse, but her family was firm that they didn't want her to be one. In 1845, her parents refused to allow her to nurse at Salisbury Infirmary, but they did allow her to spend 2 periods at the Institute of Protestant Deaconesses in Germany, and she was able to visit hospitals in London, Edinburgh, Dublin, and Paris. But this did not satisfy her. She still didn't feel like she was doing what God was telling her to do, and she didn't feel fulfilled. This drove her close to a breakdown and made her suicidal. She wrote this in 1850, quote, "My present life is suicide. I have no desire but to die." End quote. Now, certainly one of the reasons why that she refused those 4 men was because she was wanting to become a nurse, and the domestic life had no interest to her. But another reason may have been because she may have been a lesbian. Now, we don't know for certain that she actually was one, but there is some evidence that points to she may have been. Florence was really close with her father's sister Mary. She called her Aunt Mai. In January of 1840, she stayed at Coomhurst with her. Her aunt supported Florence's love for math. At this point, Florence's mother didn't see the point in furthering her math education because she wanted her daughter to be married, and math wasn't going to help her become a better wife. But her aunt convinced her to let Florence study math 2 times a week. So during April and May of 1840, Florence studied math at her mother's brother's Octavius's house, and while she was there, she helped out with his children. Her lessons ended when she returned home. Before she returned home, she became ill for several months, and her aunt cared for her during this time. They became really close, and she described in a letter that her and her aunt were, quote, like 2 lovers, end quote. Now, there's no evidence that they actually were lovers. I really don't want to accuse anybody of incest that did not commit it, but I am just using Florence's own words. She also said this about a female cousin of hers, quote, "I have never loved but one person with passion in my life, and that was her," end quote. She also wrote this to Mary Clark, quote, "I have lived and slept in the same beds with English countesses and Prussian farm women. No woman has excited passions among women more than I have," end quote. Now, again, people have pointed out that during this time the language was more flowery, so again, we don't know 100% sure that Florence was a lesbian, but it is possible. It's also possible that not only was she a lesbian, but she may have also been asexual. So she may have been a lesbian and or asexual. There are many records of her feeling disconnected from sexual attraction. That may also be because of her faith. She was a member of the Church of England. Now, I'm not saying that if you're a member of the Church of England, you have no interest in sex, because, I mean, look at Queen Victoria. She was the head of the Church of England, and we know that she bred like rabbits with her husband. But in Florence's case, she may have seen sex as a distraction from God's calling for her to become a nurse. What is clear is that Florence was sexist. She hated women. She did not support women's suffrage, though she did eventually support it, but she did it reluctantly. She also hated female doctors. She believed that it was not a woman's place to be a doctor. She thought that they made no improvements to the medical community. Florence thought that women doctors were trying to be men, and they were third-rate men. Though she did have close female friends, and she was cool with nuns. You know, I think it's kind of a shame that Florence and Queen Christina of Sweden were not alive in the same time and place, because I feel like they may have gotten along. Florence could have been like, oh, Christina, you're asexual and hate women? So do I. I feel like maybe they could have bonded over that. In 1847, Florence was in Rome and she met Sidney Herbert. He was a politician. He had once been Secretary at War, and he would become that again in the Crimean War. Florence and Sidney became friends, and she became a key advisor for him throughout his political career. Some even blamed Florence for his death. He died from Bright's disease, but some said that the pressure that she put on him made him go quicker. During this time, she traveled all around. In Egypt, she got another, quote, call from God. She wrote this in her diary, quote, God called me in the morning and asked me, would I do good for him alone without reputation, end quote. Finally, in 1853, her family gave in and they let her become a nurse, even though being a nurse was still looked down upon during this time. On August 22nd, 1853, Florence became the superintendent at the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Upper Harley Street in London, England, and she stayed there until October of 1854. Nurses did not make a lot of money, so her father gave her an annual income of £500. That is about 40,000 pounds in today's money, or for my American listeners, that is about $65,000 in US dollars. So there was never a time in Florence's life that she did not live comfortably. The Crimean War began on October 16, 1853, and it didn't end until March 30, 1856. The war was fought between an alliance of Britain, France, Turkey, and Sardinia against Russia. The Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I, was in a dispute with the Ottoman Emperor, Abdulmajid I, over which one of them had authority over Orthodox Christians living in Ottoman territory. Florence wanted to help out in the Crimean War, and through her connection with Sidney Herbert, she was able to do that. Florence arrived at Scutari Hospital in Constantinople in early November of 1854. Constantinople is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. What Florence and her team found when they got there was horrific. They found wounded soldiers living in poor conditions and being cared for by overworked medical staff. There were mass infections, many of them fatal. Hygiene was being ignored. They were short on medicine. There was also no equipment to process food for the patients. More soldiers were dying from diseases like typhus, typhoid, cholera, and dysentery than they were from injuries. During Florence's first winter at Scutari, 4,077 soldiers died there. There was overcrowding at the hospital, there were defective sewers, and a lack of ventilation. Because of Florence, the British government sent the Sanitary Commission to Scutari in March of 1855. The sewers were then flushed and ventilation was improved. Another thing that Florence did was she implemented hand washing at the hospital. During this time, there was not a lot known about medical science, and people thought that infections were caused by foul odors called miasmas. Florence wrote to the British newspaper The Times and pleaded for the government to help. The government commissioned civil engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel to design a prefabricated hospital that could be built in England and shipped. This was Renkai Hospital. It was under the management of Edmund Alexander Parks. This hospital had a death rate that was less than 1/10 of that of Scutari. Death rates were drastically reduced. The death rate went from 42% to 2% because of the improvements that Florence did or had done. Florence never took credit for reducing the death rate. In May of 1855, Florence became critically ill, and head nurse Eliza Roberts nursed her back to health. During this time, a lot of people started sending items to Crimea to help the soldiers. Florence listed and distributed all of these gifts. I'm sure that everyone that sent items were well-meaning, but not all of the items were useful to the soldiers. Queen Victoria thought that what the soldiers needed most was cologne, so she offered to send the soldiers some cologne. Florence responded back to her that a little gin would be more popular. During the Crimean War, Florence earned the nickname the Lady with the Lamp. The nickname came from a report in the Times. This is what the report said, quote, "She is a ministering angel without any exaggeration in these hospitals, and as her slender form glides quietly along each corridor, every poor fellow's face softens with gratitude at the sight of her. When all the medical officers have retired for the night and silence and darkness have settled down upon those miles of prostrate sick, she may be observed alone with a little lamp in her hand, making her solitary rounds." End quote. Then Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about her. The poem goes, quote, "Lo, in that house of misery, a lady with a lamp I see, pass through the glimmering gloom, and flint from room to room." End quote. The soldiers had given her the nickname the Lady with the Hammer because she used a hammer to break into the locked storage to get medicine. The writer of that Times article, William Russell, didn't think that that was a very ladylike nickname, so he gave her the nickname the Lady with the Lamp instead. This made Florence somewhat of a star. Florence's sister, Parthenope, became her manager. She collected cuttings of Florence, and Parthenope would also give Florence's family and friends updates about Florence. Parthenope refused to have any photos and pictures of Florence released because she knew that Florence would not like that. Only 2 portraits of Florence were released by Florence's family, and they were drawn. But they were not made for the mass market, and they were pricey. The demand for Florence's portrait was high, so people started to create their own portraits from their imagination. These images that were created looked nothing like her, and they were romantic and idealized. She started showing up on inexpensive things like paper bags and figurines. Florence did not like the ministering angel or the lady with the lamp imagery. Florence may have been a rival of Mary Seacole. Mary Seacole was half Jamaican. Mary is often referred to as a nurse, but that is not accurate. It has been said that Mary wanted to be a nurse and help out in the war, but the British government and Florence denied her, so she had to make her own way there. It has been suggested that Florence denied her because of racism. Now, Florence was racist. More on that in a little bit, but Mary didn't decide that she wanted to go to the war until after Florence had already left. Mary never even applied to be a nurse to go to the war. She just went around asking army officers if she could join them. She was told no, and that may have been due to racism, but it was not because of Florence. Mary had a business that provided meals to soldiers. Florence and Mary did meet once. Mary said in her own memoir, Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, that Florence was friendly to her. Florence had dormitories where she housed nurses. Florence made it her mission to make nurses be seen as more respectable, so she made sure that the nurses stayed away from men while these nurses stayed in these dormitories. One time, Mary asked Florence for a bed in one of those dormitories, and Florence gave her a bed. Though she also said that she tried to join Florence's group, and one of Florence's colleagues told her no, and Mary inferred that that was due to racism. Mary also wrote to the French chef Alexis Soyer, quote, "You must know, M. Soyer, that Miss Nightingale is very fond of me. When I passed Scutari, she very kindly gave me board and lodging." End quote. But Florence wrote to her brother-in-law, quote, "She was very kind to the men, and what is more, to the officers, and did some good. She made many drunk. I had the greatest difficulty in repelling Mrs. Seacole's advances, and in preventing association between her and my nurses. Absolutely out of the question. Anyone who employs Mrs. Seacole will introduce much kindness, also much drunkenness and improper conduct." End quote. So maybe Florence wasn't as friendly as Mary thought she was. Two relationships that Florence had that were a bit clearer were her relationships with Mary Clare Moore and Mary Frances Bridgman. Both of the Marys were Irish nuns. They were the Sisters of Mercy, and since both of the women were named Mary, I'm just going to call them by their last names. Moore joined the war first. She headed the first wave of Irish nuns that joined the war. Moore was okay with Florence being in control of her and the other nuns, and Florence and Moore became lifelong good friends. The second wave of Irish nuns was headed by Bridgman. Bridgman didn't trust Florence like Moore did. Bridgman did not give Florence authority over the other nuns like Moore. Bridgman thought that Florence was too ambitious. Now, I said that Florence was racist, and I'm not just going to say that and move on and have you take my word for it. You can take Florence's word for it. Florence was a big fan of colonialism. She believed that the British Empire was the savior of the world. Now, she was well aware of the horrors of colonialism, but she saw the death of indigenous people as just a price that was worth the cost. She saw everyone but the British as barbarians. She believed that enforcing British culture was necessary. She believed that anything else would be, quote, "simply preserving their barbarianism for the sake of preserving their lives," end quote. She believed that assimilation should be gradual, and that would be a good way to minimize the death toll. But she understood that there would be deaths, and she was okay with that. In Florence's sanitary statistics of native colonial schools and hospitals, she wrote, quote, "Every society which has been formed has had to sacrifice large proportions of its earlier generation to the new conditions of life arising out of the mere fact of change." End quote. It's hard to understand how a person that believed that they were called by God to end human suffering was also a supporter of colonialism, because the two contradict each other. I guess in Florence's eyes, the only people that were actually people were British. In Crimea, on November 29, 1855, the Nightingale Fund was established for training nurses. The Nightingale Fund gave Florence £45,000 to set up the first nursing school. It was called the Nightingale Training School. It was set up on July 9, 1860, at St. Thomas's Hospital. In 1859, Florence wrote Notes on Nursing. This became the cornerstone of the curriculum of not only at the Nightingale School, but other nursing schools as well. Florence helped change how nurses were seen. More trained nurses entered into the workforce. Before this, nurses really weren't trained, and they were usually former servants and widows that couldn't find any other work. Florence didn't just write nursing books. She wrote about 200 books, pamphlets, and articles in her life. Her best known work is Cassandra. Cassandra is sort of autobiographical. It speaks out against the norms that were expected of women in Victorian England. This has been described as a feminist text. Elaine Showalter, a literary critic and writer, said that Cassandra is a major text of English feminism. She said that it was a link between Mary Wollstonecraft and Virginia Woolf. Partly because of Cassandra, Florence is seen as a feminist icon. But it is really complicated because Cassandra can be seen as a feminist piece, but let us not forget that Florence had some misogynistic views. Beginning in 1857, Florence became intermittently bedridden. She suffered from depression, and it has been suggested that she suffered from brucellosis and spondylitis. Her condition didn't improve until the 1880s. Florence used what she learned about sanitation during the Crimean War to change public health legislation. During this time, sanitation was a political issue. There were some that denied that sanitation improved health. Florence created the public health legislation of 1875. This made life expectancy go from 40 years old to 60 years old. Before the legislation, London had open sewers that emptied into the rivers, so the drinking water was mixed with sewage. Florence made sewers under streets and proper drainage mandatory. She made a diagram to show how sanitation saved soldiers' lives. This diagram persuaded politicians to change the law. Florence didn't just keep her nursing knowledge to Europe. She mentored a woman named Linda Richards. Linda became America's first trained nurse in 1877. Then Linda trained other nurses in the United States, and she also trained nurses in Japan. In 1883, Florence became the first recipient of the Royal Red Cross. In 1904, Florence was appointed a Lady of Grace of the Order at St. John. In 1907, she became the first woman to be awarded the Order of Merit. And in 1908, she was given the honorary Freedom of the City of London. In her later years, Florence suffered from blindness, and on August 13, 1910, Florence died in her sleep in her home in London, England. She was 90 years old. There was an offer to have her buried at Westminster Abbey, but her family buried her in the churchyard at St. Margaret's Church in East Wellow, Hampshire. There is a memorial monument of Florence in the cloister of the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, Italy. Since 1994, her birthday has been celebrated as International May 12th Awareness Day. In 1912, the International Committee of the Red Cross created the Florence Nightingale Medal. That award is given every 2 years to nurses or nurses' aides for outstanding service. Since 1965, International Nurses Day has been celebrated on Florence's birthday. Since 1973, the President of India honors nursing professionals with the National Florence Nightingale Award every year. The oath nurses take is called the Nightingale Pledge. There are 4 hospitals in Istanbul named after Florence. There is a statue of Florence in Waterloo Place, Westminster, London, England. There are 3 statues of her in Derby. There is also a pub in Derbyshire. There is a care unit named Nightingale Macmillan in the Royal Derby Hospital. In the Derbyshire Royal Infirmary, there was a Florence Nightingale stained glass window. When the infirmary closed, it was taken to St. Peter's Church in Derby. St. Thomas Hospital in London has a Florence Nightingale Museum. There is also a Florence Nightingale Museum in Istanbul, Turkey. There is a bust of her at Gun Hill Park in Aldershot, UK. And there's also one of her at Tarlac State University in the Philippines. A statue of Florence is at Chiba University in Japan, and there is a bronze plaque in Istanbul, Turkey at Haydar Plaza Cemetery, and I'm sorry to all of my listeners in Turkey if I just pronounced that cemetery wrong. The plaque says, quote, "To Florence Nightingale, whose work near this cemetery a century ago relieved much human suffering and laid the foundation for the nursing profession." End quote. The play The Lady with the Lamp is about Florence, and that was turned into a movie. There is a musical about her entitled The Voyage of the Lass. The silent films of Victoria Cross and Florence Nightingale are about her. The movie The White Angel is too. And there is an animated film called Florence Nightingale. There have been 2 TV biopics about her. One was called Florence Nightingale, and the other was called Miss Nightingale. She has been a character in the TV shows Victoria, Magic Grandad, Al Fresco, Beating the Minds, and Hallmark Hall of Fame. She was on the 10-pound banknote. She is the only female besides female monarchs that have been on British paper currency. She even had an asteroid named after her. In 2002, BBC ranked her 52 on the list of 100 Greatest Britons. In 2006, she was 17 on a list of the top 100 historical persons in Japan. Florence is by far one of the most complicated, if not the most complicated person that I've covered on this podcast. Because on one hand, you have her support for colonialism and her misogynistic views, but on the other hand, you have her work in improving sanitation and basically creating the nursing profession, which has saved countless lives around the world. So, by far, the best part of her legacy is how she changed sanitation and the career of nursing and made them both what they are today. And that was the life of Florence Nightingale. Thank you so much for listening to the 14th episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I am going to be covering 15 people this season. Next week's episode is going to be about Emily Dickinson. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a shout out to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month. And with that, you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month. And with that, you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month. And with that, you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the Zippo Putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links, there's one for Riverside, there's one for Amazon, and there's one for Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, and you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out this podcast for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.